The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Nebraska prairie as 42-year-old Samuel Harrison wiped the sweat from his weathered brow, surveying the golden cornfields that stretched endlessly before his modest homestead. It was October 1874, and the frontier still pulsed with the raw tension between settlers and the indigenous tribes who had called this land home for countless generations. Samuel had arrived in Nebraska territory 3 years earlier with nothing but a worn plow, a stubborn mule named Moses, and an unshakable determination to carve out a life from the unforgiving wilderness. His small ranch consisted of a sturdy log cabin, a weathered barn that had seen better days, and 40 acres of the richest soil he had ever laid eyes upon. The corn harvest this year had been particularly bountiful, with stalks reaching heights that would make any farmer's heart swell with pride. Samuel was not like the other settlers who had flooded into the territory with guns blazing and hearts hardened against the native population. He had grown up listening to his grandfather's stories about cooperation and mutual respect. Tales of early colonists who had survived harsh winters only through the kindness and wisdom of indigenous peoples. These stories had shaped Samuel's worldview, instilling in him a deep belief that understanding and compassion could bridge even the widest cultural divides. His neighbors often mocked him for what they called his soft heart and naive idealism, but Samuel remained steadfast in his conviction that violence was not the only path forward in this contested land. Before I continue with this incredible story of cultural exchange and its dramatic consequences, I want to ask you to please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and we love connecting with viewers from all around the world. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with Samuel emerging from his cabin at dawn to tend to his livestock and inspect his crops. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and a light frost had painted the grass with delicate silver crystals that sparkled in the early sunlight. As he made his way toward the barn to milk his 2 cows, Bessie and Clara, Samuel noticed movement at the edge of his property line. A lone figure sat hunched beneath the sprawling oak tree that marked the boundary between his land and the vast open prairie beyond. Drawing closer, Samuel could see that it was a young Native American man, probably no more than 20 years old, wearing traditional buckskin clothing that had seen better days. The young man's ribs were visible through his thin frame, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had not eaten a proper meal in many days. His long black hair was matted and unkempt, and his moccasins were worn through in several places, evidence of long travels across harsh terrain. Most striking of all was the way he sat perfectly still, as if he had resigned himself to whatever fate awaited him in this encounter with the white settler. Samuel approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, speaking in the few words of Lakota he had learned from a traveling missionary. "How, Kola," he said, using the greeting for, "Hello, friend." The young man's eyes widened in surprise at hearing his native tongue spoken by a white farmer. Samuel continued in English, gesturing toward his cabin. "You look hungry, friend. Would you like some food?" The young man, who would later introduce himself as Takoda, meaning friend to everyone in his language, hesitated for a long moment before nodding slowly. Samuel helped him to his feet and guided him toward the cabin, where he prepared a hearty breakfast of eggs, bacon, fresh bread, and strong coffee. As Takoda ate with the desperate hunger of someone who had been surviving on roots and berries for weeks, Samuel learned his story through a mixture of broken English, hand gestures, and the universal language of human compassion. Takoda belonged to a small band of Lakota who had been displaced from their traditional hunting grounds by the encroachment of settlers and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. His people were scattered, some forced onto reservations hundreds of miles away, others trying to maintain their traditional way of life in increasingly hostile territory. Takoda had been traveling alone for nearly a month, searching for any remaining members of his family who might have survived the recent conflicts that had torn his world apart. He was weak, lost, and facing the very real possibility of starving to death before winter's full fury arrived. As they sat together at Samuel's rough-hewn kitchen table, sharing a meal and attempting to communicate across the vast cultural divide that separated them, Samuel found himself deeply moved by the young man's plight. Here was a human being, not so different from himself, who had been reduced to wandering the prairie in search of basic survival. Samuel had always believed that the land was vast enough for everyone, that there had to be a way for different peoples to coexist peacefully and even help one another thrive. After breakfast, Samuel led Takoda outside to show him around the homestead. They walked through the cornfields, where the tall stalks rustled gently in the morning breeze, heavy with ears of golden corn that represented months of backbreaking labor and careful cultivation. Samuel could see the wonder in Takoda's eyes as he examined the organized rows of crops, the irrigation channels that carried water from the nearby creek, and the various tools and techniques that had made such abundant harvests possible. It was then that Samuel had an idea that would change both of their lives forever. Using gestures and simple words, he began to explain to Takoda the principles of agriculture that he had learned from his father and grandfather back in Ohio. He showed him how to test the soil for moisture and nutrients, how to space the corn plants for optimal growth, and how to time the planting to take advantage of the seasonal rains. Takoda proved to be an eager and intelligent student, asking questions through gestures and broken English, clearly fascinated by these farming techniques that could provide a reliable source of food even in harsh conditions. For the next several hours, Samuel and Takoda worked side by side in a small section of field that Samuel had set aside for next year's planting. Samuel demonstrated how to prepare the soil, breaking up the hard-packed earth with a hoe and mixing in organic matter to improve its fertility. He showed Takoda how to create proper furrows for planting, explaining the importance of depth and spacing for corn seeds. The young Lakota man proved to have natural instincts for the work, quickly grasping the concepts and even suggesting improvements based on his own knowledge of the local climate and soil conditions. As the day progressed, their initial awkwardness gave way to a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Samuel found himself learning as much from Takoda as he was teaching, gaining insights into the natural rhythms of the prairie, the behavior of local wildlife, and traditional methods of food preservation that had sustained indigenous peoples for countless generations. Takoda, in turn, marveled at the efficiency of European farming techniques and began to envision how these methods might be adapted to help his scattered people establish more stable food sources. When evening approached, Samuel insisted that Takoda stay the night in the barn, providing him with warm blankets and another hearty meal. They sat by the fire as darkness fell, sharing stories about their respective families and cultures, building bridges of understanding that transcended language barriers. Samuel spoke of his late wife, Martha, who had died of fever during their second winter in Nebraska, and his dreams of building a prosperous farm that could support a large family. Takoda shared memories of his childhood, describing the traditional ways of his people, their deep spiritual connection to the land, and the devastating changes that had swept through their world in recent years. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a sharp wind blowing across the prairie that carried the scent of approaching winter. Samuel woke early, as was his custom, and went about his morning chores while Takoda still slept in the barn. He milked the cows, fed the chickens, and checked on his horses, enjoying the peaceful routine that had become the foundation of his frontier life. The sun was just beginning to rise above the eastern horizon when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. At first, it appeared to be a dark line on the distant prairie, like a shadow cast by a low-hanging cloud. But as Samuel shaded his eyes and squinted into the morning light, he realized with growing horror that the line was moving, flowing across the landscape like a dark river of humanity. As the figures drew closer, he could make out individual riders. Hundreds upon hundreds of them, their war paint and feathers clearly visible even at a distance. The thundering of hooves grew louder with each passing moment, creating a sound like an approaching storm that seemed to shake the very earth beneath his feet. Samuel's heart pounded as he realized the magnitude of what was approaching his homestead. This was not a small raiding party or a group of displaced families seeking shelter. This was a massive war party, organized and purposeful, riding with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning and deadly intent. He estimated there had to be at least 600 warriors, representing multiple tribes based on the variety of war paint patterns and tribal regalia he could observe through his spyglass. Racing to the barn, Samuel shook Takoda awake, pointing frantically toward the approaching horde. The young Lakota man's face went pale as he recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. Through urgent gestures and rapid words in his native language, Takoda tried to explain what was happening, but Samuel could understand enough from the young man's expression to know that they were in mortal danger. The war party spread out as it approached the ranch, forming a massive circle that completely surrounded Samuel's property. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, cutting off all possible escape routes and positioning themselves for what appeared to be either a siege or an all-out assault. Their horses snorted and stamped impatiently, sensing the tension in the air, while the riders sat motionless as statues, their weapons ready but not yet raised in open hostility. At the center of this intimidating display rode a figure who commanded immediate respect and attention. He was a tall, powerfully built man in his 50s, wearing an elaborate war bonnet adorned with eagle feathers that caught the morning light like golden flames. His face was painted with intricate designs in red and black, and his bearing spoke of absolute authority and years of hard-won experience in warfare. This was clearly a war chief of considerable importance, someone whose word could mean the difference between life and death for everyone on the ranch. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to understand what had brought this massive force to his doorstep. Had his kindness to Takoda somehow been misinterpreted as an act of aggression? Was this young man perhaps more important than he had let on, possibly the son or relative of a prominent chief? Or had Samuel unknowingly violated some sacred boundary or cultural taboo that demanded retribution? The questions swirled through his thoughts as he watched the war chief dismount and begin walking slowly toward the ranch buildings. Takoda grabbed Samuel's arm, speaking urgently in a mixture of Lakota and broken English. From what Samuel could understand, the young man was trying to explain that the war chief was his uncle, a powerful leader named Chief Iron Bear, who commanded respect and fear across the entire region. Takoda's disappearance had apparently triggered a massive search effort, and when scouts had finally tracked him to Samuel's ranch, the chief had assumed the worst about the white farmer's intentions. The situation was a powder keg waiting to explode, with 600 armed warriors surrounding a lone settler who had done nothing more than show kindness to a hungry young man. Samuel knew that any wrong move, any misunderstood gesture, or poorly chosen word could result in his death and the destruction of everything he had worked so hard to build. But he also recognized that this moment represented something much larger than his own survival. This was a crossroads where the future relationship between settlers and indigenous peoples might be determined by the choices made in the next few minutes. Drawing upon every ounce of courage he possessed, Samuel walked slowly toward the approaching war chief, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. He had learned enough about Native American customs to know that showing fear or aggression would be interpreted as weakness or hostility, either of which could prove fatal in this situation. Instead, He maintained steady eye contact with Chief Iron Bear, demonstrating respect while also showing that he was not intimidated by the overwhelming display of force surrounding him. When the two men stood face to face, separated by only a few feet and the vast cultural chasm that divided their peoples, Samuel spoke in the clearest, most respectful tone he could manage. "Chief Iron Bear," he said, using the name Takoda had provided, "your nephew is safe and well. He came to me hungry and lost, and I gave him food and shelter, as any decent man would do for a fellow human being in need." Chief Iron Bear studied Samuel's face intently, searching for any sign of deception or hidden malice. The war chief's eyes were like dark pools that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, weighing their character and intentions with the wisdom of someone who had survived decades of conflict and betrayal. Around them, the 600 warriors remained motionless on their horses, creating an atmosphere of barely contained violence that could explode into action at the slightest provocation. Takoda stepped forward, positioning himself between his uncle and the white farmer who had shown him such unexpected kindness. In rapid Lakota, he began explaining what had transpired over the past day and night, describing Samuel's generosity, his willingness to share knowledge about farming techniques, and his genuine desire to build bridges of understanding between their peoples. The young man's voice carried the passion of someone defending a friend, and Samuel could see the surprise and confusion in Chief Iron Bear's eyes as he listened to his nephew's account. The war chief asked several sharp questions in Lakota, his tone suggesting skepticism about Takoda's positive portrayal of the white settler. Samuel could only stand and wait as his fate was debated in a language he barely understood, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether he lived to see another sunset. The tension was so thick it seemed almost tangible, like a storm cloud ready to unleash its fury upon the earth below. Finally, Chief Iron Bear turned his attention back to Samuel, studying him with renewed interest. Through Takoda, who served as translator, the chief asked why a white man would help a Native American when most settlers viewed indigenous peoples as enemies to be driven away or destroyed. Samuel's answer came from the deepest part of his heart, shaped by the values his grandfather had instilled in him and his own experiences on the frontier. "Because we are all human beings trying to survive in a harsh world," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Because kindness costs nothing but can mean everything to someone in need. Because I believe there is enough land and enough opportunity for all of us to prosper if we choose cooperation over conflict." Chief Iron Bear listened to the translation with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the restless movements of horses and the whisper of wind across the prairie grass. Samuel could feel the eyes of 600 warriors upon him, each one ready to act on their chief's command, whether that command meant peace or war. Then, to Samuel's amazement, Chief Iron Bear began to smile. It was a slow, gradual expression that transformed his stern features and revealed the wisdom and humanity beneath the war paint and feathers. The chief spoke again in Lakota, his tone now carrying warmth and approval rather than suspicion and hostility. Takoda's face lit up with relief and joy as he translated his uncle's words. "My uncle says that you have shown true wisdom and courage," Takoda explained, his voice trembling with emotion. "He says that any man who would teach farming to a hungry Native American, knowing that this knowledge could help our people become more self-sufficient and less dependent on hunting grounds that are disappearing, is a man who understands the future better than most." Chief Iron Bear stepped forward and extended his hand to Samuel in a gesture that bridged two worlds and two very different ways of life. As they shook hands, the war chief spoke again, and Takoda translated with obvious pride and excitement. "He says that you will always be welcome among our people, and that any who would harm you would answer to him personally. He also says that he would like to learn more about these farming techniques that could help his people survive the changes that are coming to this land. The transformation in the atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. What had moments before been a scene of potential violence and destruction suddenly became a gathering of curiosity and hope. Warriors dismounted and approached the ranch buildings with genuine interest, eager to see the farming techniques that had produced such abundant crops. Chief Iron Bear walked through Samuel's cornfields with the careful attention of someone evaluating a potential solution to his people's most pressing problems. Over the next several hours, Samuel found himself conducting an impromptu agricultural seminar for 600 Native American warriors. He demonstrated plowing techniques, explained crop rotation principles, and showed how proper irrigation could maximize yields even in dry years. The warriors asked intelligent questions through various translators, clearly understanding the potential value of this knowledge for their own communities. Chief Iron Bear was particularly interested in the storage and preservation methods that allowed Samuel to maintain food supplies throughout the harsh winter months. The chief explained through Takoda that many of his people were struggling to adapt to life on reservations where traditional hunting and gathering were no longer viable options. Learning to farm successfully could mean the difference between prosperity and starvation for entire communities. As the day progressed, what had begun as a potential massacre evolved into something unprecedented in the history of the frontier. A genuine cultural exchange based on mutual respect and shared practical needs. Samuel shared his knowledge freely, while the Native Americans offered insights into local weather patterns, soil conditions, and natural pest control methods that had been developed over countless generations of living in harmony with the land. When evening approached, Chief Iron Bear made an announcement that surprised everyone present. Through Takoda, he declared that Samuel would be adopted as an honorary member of their tribe, with all the rights and protections that such status entailed. Furthermore, the chief invited Samuel to visit their winter camp to continue teaching farming techniques to anyone who wished to learn. The war party that had arrived at dawn, with the potential for violence, departed at sunset carrying seeds, farming tools, and most importantly, hope for a different kind of future. Samuel stood in his doorway, watching the 600 warriors ride away into the gathering darkness, their silhouettes gradually disappearing into the vast expanse of the prairie. Takoda remained behind, having decided to stay and learn everything he could about farming before returning to his people as a teacher and ambassador of these new techniques. As they sat by the fire that night, sharing a simple meal and reflecting on the extraordinary events of the day, both men understood that they had witnessed something rare and precious, a moment when understanding had triumphed over fear, when cooperation had defeated conflict, and when the simple act of teaching a hungry person to grow food had opened the door to a better future for everyone involved. The story of the farmer who taught a Native American to plant corn and found himself surrounded by 600 warriors became legend throughout the territory, inspiring other settlers and indigenous peoples to seek peaceful solutions to their conflicts. Samuel's ranch became a meeting place where different cultures could come together to share knowledge and build bridges of understanding that would endure long after the frontier era had passed into history.